Hey guys, so today is the last lesson of Science 10. Congratulations. Today we're going to be going over some of the different biomes that exist in Canada, as well as how to read a climatograph. So biomes are probably something that you have learned about before. There are a bunch of different ways to describe biomes. Scientists aren't in total disagreement about how many biomes even exist in the world. We're going to be going over the 6 that are kind of like widely agreed upon, but depending on what source you're looking at, you might see some other biomes as well. And then we're also going to talk about which of these 6 biomes exist in Canada, and then at the end, draw and read climatographs. On a test or quiz, you are not going to have to draw any climatographs, just be able to interpret them. And by that I mean, look at a climatograph and figure out which biome it matches. So a biome is just a large geographical region with a specific range of temperature and precipitation, and where plants and animals are well adapted to those conditions. The reason it's important that the plants and animals are well adapted to the conditions is because it means that that climate has been stable for a long period of time, and therefore that it's an accurate representation of that biome. The 6 different biomes that we are going to be looking at is the tundra, the taiga, the deciduous forest, grassland, desert, and rainforest biomes. And this is kind of how those are spread out around the world. Over here in Canada, we have mainly tundra, taiga, grassland, and some temperate forests or the deciduous forest. So the tundra is the region that is in the Arctic areas, both in North America as well as Europe and Russia. There is a great variety of the length of days in the tundra. The summer days are very, very long. The winter days are very, very short. The tundra also has the lowest amount of insolation compared to any biome, meaning the least amount of solar radiation coming into it. Because of that, there is snow and ice year-round, and because of that, we have really high albedo in the tundra. So high albedo, but low insolation. There's very low precipitation, very cold temperatures, and very few plants and animals. The plants that do exist tend to be very low-lying and have very short life cycles, and the animals tend to be squat, so their arms and legs tend to be very short, and they have very thick coats, all to help preserve body heat. The taiga is south of the tundra. It is also called the boreal forest, and that's where you find lots of coniferous or evergreen trees. This is the largest of the biomes here in Canada. You can see how much of Canada is covered by boreal forest. Most animals are relatively inactive in the winter in this area, so a lot of them will hibernate, for instance, or migrate out. The coats of the animals also tend to change colors in order to blend with their surroundings in different seasons. So they might be white in the winter and then brown in the summer. It is warmer than the tundra, but still has fairly low average temperature. And it does have more precipitation than the tundra, mostly in the form of snow. Then we get to the deciduous forest, also called the temperate forest, where we find a lot of deciduous trees, which are just trees that lose their leaves. It has a much more moderate climate with a longer growing season compared to the boreal forest or the tundra. It does have very distinct summer and winter seasons with lots of variation in the amount of solar radiation. It is much warmer than the boreal forest and has much more biodiversity than the boreal forest, and the animals tend to remain more active year-round. There's also a bit more precipitation than the boreal forest. Then we get to the grassland, which is as it suggests, very grassy. There's not a lot of trees because there's just quite frankly not enough water to support trees. It does have one of the lower amounts of precipitation. It is much lower than the boreal forest or the deciduous forest. It has slightly more than the tundra and desert, but that is it. Also has very distinct seasons. Here in North America, our grassland is very warm in the summer and very cold in the winters. In Africa, the grassland there is always warm, but they have wet and dry seasons. In North America, we often refer to the grassland as the prairies, whereas in Africa, the grassland is referred to as the savanna, which has a much higher average temperature than the prairies, but in both has quite low average precipitation. And there are different animals in the grassland. You would usually find large grazers. So in the savanna, you might see that in the terms of like zebras, as you can see above. Here in the prairies, we might see that in the form of cows. And you also tend to have a lot of small burrowing animals. Then we get to the rainforest, which has the highest amount of biodiversity in both plants and animals than any other biome by far. It also has a lot more precipitation than any other biome. It is warm year-round and supports plant growth year-round, a lot of the plants having broad leaves. Then the desert has very low precipitation, similar amounts of precipitation to the tundra, but in the desert it's usually rain rather than snow. Also has very little plant life, but in the case of the desert, that's usually cacti and other drought-tolerant plants. There is a lot of insolation, which is very different from the tundra, making it very, very hot during the day. Since there's not a lot of water or plants in the desert, very little of that heat is actually absorbed and retained, which is why it gets so cold at night, because in a place that has more plant life and more water, that heat would be slowly released from the plants and from the water during the night. In the desert, because it hasn't been absorbed, it just dissipates into the atmosphere as soon as the sun goes down. And there's also not a lot of plants and animals in the desert. It has fairly low biodiversity, just because not a lot of organisms are adapted to that dry climate. In Canada, we have 4 major biomes: the tundra, which you can find in Nunavut, Northern Ontario and Quebec, and northeastern Manitoba for the most part. Then we have the taiga, which is the largest biome in Canada. As I said, it makes up the majority of every province and territory except Nunavut. The deciduous forest is mainly just in southern Ontario, as well as a little bit in some of the Atlantic provinces. And then the grassland is in southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and southwestern Manitoba. The reason that we have different biomes is because of variations in precipitation and temperature based on latitude and altitude. So latitude is just how far away you are from the equator. Obviously, the further you are from the equator, the less solar energy, so the less insolation, and therefore the colder that area will be. Altitude is how high above sea level an area is, and the higher you go above sea level, the thinner the atmosphere, which also results in colder temperatures. And then closest to a large body of water, as well as the direction of prevailing winds, also affects temperature and precipitation. If you are close to a large body of water, your temperature is more moderate. It's regulated by that large body of water. And if you are downwind from a large body of water, you can expect a lot more precipitation. A climatograph is a graph that summarizes the average temperature and the total precipitation for each month of the year in a specific area. The x-axis will have all of the different months, and then you'll actually have 2 y-axes, one on each side of the graph. One is going to have total precipitation, the other will have the average temperature. And then temperature is usually in a line graph, precipitation is usually in a bar graph. And yeah, make sure that the axes are labeled and always double check the labels of the axes to kind of get an idea of what you're looking at. So here are some examples of what your climatograph would look like. So here in Edmonton, you can see the red line is again the temperature. So in Edmonton, our coldest month would be January, which has an average temperature of -15. And then the warmest month would be July with an average temperature of about +15. And then the blue bar graph in this case is the precipitation, which is measured in millimeters. The wettest month also being July with a total precipitation, looks like over 100 millimeters, whereas February and March have fairly low amounts of precipitation with less than 20 millimeters each. If we compare that to our Toronto climatograph, you can see the coldest month still January, but its average temperature is just below -5. The warmest average temperature is once again in July, but it's over 20 degrees Celsius. And then the precipitation is much more kind of even. It does peak here in August with just over 80 millimeters. And it's kind of lowest in February, but over 40 millimeters still. But yeah, the reason that you guys need to know about climatographs is to be able to identify different biomes. So as you can see with a tundra biome, which is this top one up here, you have very low levels of precipitation, never gets above 5 centimeters of precipitation, and it's quite low in the middle of the year. And then the temperature, as you can see, you know, gets to maybe 5 degrees Celsius in the summer, and is almost to -30 in the winter. Compare that to the Sahara, which would be a desert biome. The precipitation here, again, it might look a lot higher than our tundra one, but this precipitation is measured in centimeters and this one is in millimeters. We're still only getting 1, 2, 3, 4, like less than 6 centimeters at the rainiest part of the year and no rain in some parts of the year. So it's still very, very low precipitation. And the temperature, I realize you can't, this is super blurry, but the temperature is much higher than what you would see in the Arctic. This is, I think, 0 degrees Celsius, -10, 15. So it doesn't get much below 15 degrees Celsius, even in the winter. And it can get, you know, almost up to 30 degrees Celsius in the summer on average. Okay, so I'm actually going to go over a couple examples of different biomes that you will have to recognize and what those would look like. And then if you follow this link, it'll bring you to a website where you can practice some of your biomes. I will tell you which biomes it is that you need to be able to identify. Okay, so I have sketched out 4 different climatographs here for you, and I've only labeled the axis on the first one. This is going to be in degrees Celsius. This is going to be the precipitation in millimeters, but just pretend that all of these axes are the exact same as each other. Now, in this first climatograph, my precipitation is very low, as is my temperature, which makes this a tundra. The temperature doesn't necessarily have to be this low. It could peak even higher than this in the summer, but very low temperatures, especially in the winter months, and low precipitation is a tundra. Now, if you have a bit higher amounts of precipitation and higher temperature, that is going to be a grassland. It still is a fairly low amount of precipitation. It's not like a middle amount, but it's more precipitation than you would get in a tundra. A desert can be identified by much higher temperatures than the tundra, but equally low precipitation. And you might see some months, especially in the summer, with no precipitation at all. That would be a desert. And then if you have really high precipitation, like what's shown here, and also fairly high or moderate temperatures, that is going to be a rainforest. These are the only 4 of these 6 biomes that you need to be able to identify using a climatograph. You will not be asked to identify the boreal forest or the deciduous forest because they're just too hard to tell apart. Okay, that's it for today's lesson.